The legend of Hollow Hill. The small town of Hollow Hill nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and jagged cliffs. It was a quiet place, where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a pace dictated by the seasons. But for the past 6 months, the town had been gripped by a terror that no one could explain. Every full moon, something emerged from the shadows to stalk the streets, leaving behind a trail of destruction and fear. No one could agree on what the creature looked like. Some claimed it was a wolf the size of a horse, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. Others swore it was a serpent-like beast with scales that shimmered in the moonlight. A few even insisted it was a shadowy figure, humanoid but twisted, with a voice that chilled the blood. The first attack had been on Old Man Hargrove's farm. His sheep were found torn to pieces, their bodies arranged in a grotesque pattern. The next month, the creature struck again, this time at the edge of town, where it shattered windows and left deep gouges in the wooden walls of the general store. By the third attack, the townsfolk were too terrified to leave their homes during the full moon. They barred their doors and windows, whispering prayers to whatever gods might listen. The town council held emergency meetings, but no one could agree on what to do. Some suggested forming a militia to hunt the beast, while others argued it was a curse, a punishment for some long-forgotten sin. The debate raged on until one man stepped forward with a solution. His name was Elias Crane, a hunter who had recently returned to Hollow Hill after years of wandering the wilderness. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by the elements and eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "I'll kill it," he said simply, "but I'll need help." The council agreed, and a group of volunteers was assembled. They were a motley crew: farmers, tradesmen, and a few young men eager to prove themselves. Elias spent the days leading up to the next full moon preparing. He studied the accounts of the attacks, noting the patterns and the locations. He inspected the claw marks left on the general store and the strange symbols carved into the ground near Hargrove's farm. He even ventured into the forest, following the faint trail the creature had left behind. As the full moon approached, the tension in Hollow Hill grew palpable. The townsfolk watched Elias with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could one man, even a seasoned hunter like Elias, really defeat the beast that had terrorized them for so long? On the night of the full moon, Elias and his team gathered at the edge of town, armed with rifles, torches, and whatever weapons they could find. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. The forest loomed ahead, dark and silent, as if holding its breath. Elias turned to his team. "Stay close, and don't let your guard down. This thing is cunning, and it's not like anything you've faced before." They nodded, their faces pale but determined. Together, they ventured into the forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. Hours passed and they found nothing. The tension began to wear on the group, and some started to whisper that the creature wasn't real, that it was all just a story. But Elias remained focused, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then, just as they were about to turn back, they heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The team froze, their breath visible in the cold night air. Elias raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Get ready," he whispered. The growl grew louder, closer, and then, from the darkness, it emerged. The first encounter. The creature that stepped into the moonlight was unlike anything Elias or his team had ever seen. Its form was fluid, shifting as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. One moment, it had the hunched posture of a wolf, its fur bristling and its eyes glowing like embers. The next, it seemed to stretch and elongate, its body becoming serpentine, scales glinting in the pale light. Its mouth was a jagged maw of teeth, and its claws, long, curved, and deadly, scraped against the ground as it moved. But the most unsettling thing was its eyes. They were human, filled with a malevolent intelligence that seemed to pierce straight through the hunters' souls. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. "Steady," he murmured to his team. "Don't let it get inside your heads." The creature let out a roar that shook the trees, and then it lunged. Chaos erupted. The hunters fired their rifles, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the beast, as if it were made of smoke. It moved with unnatural speed, darting between the trees and striking from the shadows. One by one, the hunters fell, not from physical wounds but from sheer terror. They dropped their weapons and fled, their screams echoing through the forest. Elias stood his ground, his heart pounding but his mind clear. He had faced dangerous animals before. Bears, mountain lions, even a rogue grizzly once. But this was different. This thing wasn't just a predator. It was something more, something that fed on fear itself. He could feel it probing his mind, searching for weaknesses, for the things that scared him most. "You're not real," Elias muttered, more to himself than to the creature. "You're just a shadow." The beast paused, its head tilting as if considering his words. Then it let out a low, guttural laugh that sent a chill down Elias's spine. It lunged again, and this time Elias was ready. He dropped his rifle and drew a long, curved hunting knife from his belt. As the creature closed in, he sidestepped and slashed at its flank. The blade connected, and the beast let out a shriek of pain. Black, oily blood spilled from the wound. Elias leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "We need to hit it where it's weakest. It feeds on fear, so we need to take away its food. We need to show it that we're not afraid." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "And how do we do that?" another asked. Elias straightened. "We go back out there, all of us, together. We show it that we're not going to be terrorized anymore." The room erupted into protests. "That's suicide," someone shouted. "We're not hunters. We'll be slaughtered." Elias raised his hand, silencing the room. "I'm not saying we fight it. I'm saying we face it. We stand together, and we show it that we're stronger than it thinks we are." The council members hesitated, but eventually they agreed. They would gather the townsfolk and prepare for the next full moon. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had. Over the next few weeks, Elias worked tirelessly to prepare the town. He organized drills, teaching the townsfolk how to stay calm under pressure and how to work together. He also continued his research, scouring old books and talking to anyone who might have information about the creature. He learned about shapeshifters, creatures that could take on any form and fed on human emotions. The more he learned, the more he realized how dangerous the beast truly was. As the next full moon approached, the tension in Hollow Hill grew. The townsfolk were nervous, but they trusted Elias. He had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that they weren't powerless. On the night of the full moon, the entire town gathered in the square, armed with torches and whatever weapons they could find. Elias stood at the front, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his knife at his side. He looked out over the crowd, his expression calm but determined. "Remember," he said, "this thing feeds on fear. If we stand together, if we show it that we're not afraid, we can beat it." The townsfolk nodded, their faces set with resolve. Together, they marched to the edge of the forest, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. They didn't have to wait long. The creature emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and writhing as it approached. The townsfolk gasped, but they held their ground. Elias stepped forward, his eyes locked on the beast. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. The creature let out a roar, but this time, it didn't attack. It seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of what to do. Elias took another step forward, and the townsfolk followed, their torches held high. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually win. But then the creature's form shifted again, and this time, it took on a shape that made Elias's blood run cold. The mirror of darkness. The creature's form solidified into something that made the crowd gasp and stagger back. It was no longer a wolf, a serpent, or a shadowy figure. It was them. Each person in the crowd saw their own face staring back at them, twisted into a grotesque mask of their deepest fears and regrets. For Elias, the creature wore his face, but it was a version of himself he had tried to bury long ago. A man consumed by guilt, rage, and a darkness he had carried since his youth. The townsfolk froze, their courage wavering as the beast fed on their terror. Some dropped their torches and fled, while others stood paralyzed, unable to look away from their own reflections. Elias, however, clenched his fists and stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's not real," he shouted. "It's just a trick. Don't let it get inside your heads." But his words were drowned out by the creature's laughter, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a mocking, hollow laugh that echoed the darkest corners of their minds. The beast began to move, its form shifting fluidly as it stalked the edges of the crowd. It didn't attack physically. Instead, it whispered voices that sounded like their own, taunting them with their deepest insecurities. "You'll never be enough," it hissed to a young mother clutching her child. "You're a failure," it growled to an elderly man who had lost his farm. To Elias, it whispered, "You can't save them. You couldn't save her." Elias flinched at the mention of her. His mind flashed back to a memory he had tried to forget. His younger sister, Clara, who had died in a fire when they were children. He had blamed himself for years, believing he could have saved her if he had been faster, stronger, braver. The creature's words dug into that old wound, and for a moment, he felt the weight of his guilt crushing him. But then he shook his head, forcing himself to focus. "This is what it wants," he muttered. "It wants me to doubt myself. It wants all of us to doubt ourselves." He turned to the townsfolk, who were still reeling from the creature's psychological assault. "Listen to me," he shouted. "This thing is feeding on your fear. Don't give it what it wants. Stand together." His words seemed to reach a few of them. A handful of townsfolk stepped forward, their faces pale but determined. They formed a loose circle around the creature, their torches held high. The beast snarled, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its hold on their minds. Elias raised his knife and stepped closer. "You're not real," he said, his voice steady. "You're just a shadow, and shadows can't hurt us unless we let them." The creature lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Elias dodged, but not fast enough. The beast's claws grazed his arm, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth and swung his knife, aiming for the creature's throat. The blade connected, and the beast let out a shriek that sounded almost human. It stumbled back, its form flickering and shifting as if it were losing control. For a moment, Elias thought they might have a chance. But then the creature's form solidified again, and this time it took on a new shape, one that made Elias's blood run cold. It was Clara. The creature stood before him, no longer a monstrous beast but a young girl with wide, innocent eyes and a smile that broke his heart. She looked exactly as he remembered her, down to the freckles on her nose and the ribbon in her hair. But there was something wrong about her, something unnatural. Her eyes were too dark, her smile too sharp. "Elias," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "Why did you let me die?" Elias froze, his knife slipping from his hand. He felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. "Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The creature, now wearing Clara's form, stepped closer to Elias, her head tilted to one side. "You could have saved me," she said, "but you were too scared. You've always been too scared." Elias's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. "I tried," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to save you." "No, you didn't," Clara said, her voice hardening. "You ran. You left me to die. And now you're going to leave them too." He blinked, his vision clearing, and saw the creature for what it really was. A twisted, malevolent thing wearing his sister's face like a mask. Rage surged through him, burning away the fear and guilt. "You're not her," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're not going to win." The creature's smile faltered. It stepped back, its form flickering as if it were losing its grip on the illusion. Elias reached down and picked up his knife, his eyes locked on the beast. "This ends now," he said. The creature let out a roar and lunged at him, its form shifting back into something monstrous. But Elias was ready. He sidestepped its attack and slashed at its side, his blade cutting deep. The creature howled in pain, its black blood spilling onto the ground. The townsfolk, emboldened by Elias's resolve, began to close in, their torches held high. The creature thrashed and snarled, but it was clearly weakening. Its form flickered and shifted, unable to maintain a solid shape. Elias pressed his advantage, driving the creature back with a series of precise strikes. But just as he thought he had it cornered, the beast let out a final, ear-splitting shriek and vanished into the shadows. The forest fell silent. The townsfolk stood there, their torches flickering in the darkness, unsure of what to do next. Elias lowered his knife, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "Is it gone?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Elias shook his head. "No, it's not gone. It's just regrouping. We heard it, but we didn't kill it." The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. "So what do we do now?" one of them asked. Elias looked out into the forest, his expression grim. "We find its lair. We finish this." The lair of shadows. The days following the confrontation were tense. Hollow Hill was a town on edge, its people haunted by the creature's psychological assault. Elias spent his time gathering supplies and preparing for the next phase of his plan. He knew the beast wasn't truly defeated. It had merely retreated to lick its wounds. If they were going to destroy it, they needed to find its lair and strike at its heart. Elias enlisted the help of a small group of volunteers. Sarah, the young woman who had snapped him out of his trance. Tom, a burly blacksmith with a steady hand. And Miriam, an elderly herbalist who knew the forest better than anyone. Together, they formed a determined but uneasy team. Each of them had faced the creature's illusions, and each carried the scars of that encounter. The group set out at dawn, following the trail of black blood Elias had wounded the beast with. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the animals themselves were afraid to make a sound. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the trees growing thicker and the air colder. Eventually, they came to a clearing where the ground was scorched and barren, and the trees were twisted into grotesque shapes. At the center of the clearing was a cave, its entrance shrouded in shadows. "This is it," Elias said, his voice low. "The lair." The group hesitated at the edge of the clearing, their courage wavering. The cave seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Elias turned to his companions, his expression grim but determined. "Stay close," he said, "and whatever you do, don't let it get inside your heads." They nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Together, they approached the cave, their torches casting flickering light on the walls. The interior was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the darkness. Elias recognized them from his research. They were ancient runes, used to summon and bind dark entities. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency that made their teeth ache. Then, they heard it, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the cavern. The creature was here, and it knew they were coming. The group pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Eventually, they reached a large chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were lined with bones, animal and human alike, and the floor was littered with the remnants of the creature's victims. At the center of the chamber was a pool of black, oily liquid, its surface rippling as if something were moving beneath it. And there, standing at the edge of the pool, was the creature. It was different now. Its form was more solid, more defined, as if it had drawn strength from the darkness of its lair. It was still a shapeshifter, but its default form was something truly monstrous. A hulking, humanoid figure with elongated limbs, jagged claws, and a face that was a twisted amalgamation of every fear it had ever consumed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The creature turned to face them, its head tilting to one side as if amused. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Elias stepped forward, his knife in one hand and a torch in the other. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady. The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you can kill me?" it sneered. "I am fear itself. I am the darkness in your heart. You cannot destroy me." "We'll see about that," Elias replied. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Elias dodged, but the beast was faster here, stronger. It struck him with a backhanded blow that sent him sprawling. Tom and Sarah rushed forward, their weapons raised, but the creature swatted them aside like flies. Miriam hung back, her hands trembling as she clutched a vial of liquid. Elias struggled to his feet, his ribs aching. He knew they couldn't win in a straight fight. The creature was too powerful in its lair. They needed a different approach. "Miriam!" he shouted. "Now!" The herbalist nodded and hurled the vial at the creature. It shattered against its chest, releasing a cloud of pungent smoke. The beast roared, its form flickering as the smoke disrupted its connection to the dark energy of the lair. "It's working!" Sarah cried. Elias seized the opportunity. He grabbed a torch and charged at the creature, thrusting the flame into its chest. The beast howled in pain, its form writhing and shifting as it tried to escape the fire. Elias pressed the attack, driving the creature back toward the pool of black liquid. "This is for Clara," he shouted, his voice filled with rage and grief. "And for everyone else you've hurt." The creature stumbled, its form flickering and dissolving as the flames consumed it. With a final ear-splitting shriek, it fell into the pool, its body disintegrating into the oily liquid. The surface of the pool bubbled and churned, then stilled, the dark energy dissipating. The chamber fell silent. Elias stood at the edge of the pool, his chest heaving, his torch still clutched in his hand. The others gathered around him, their faces pale but relieved. "Is it over?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. Elias nodded. "It's over." But as they turned to leave, something stirred in the shadows. The pool began to ripple again, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. Elias froze, his heart sinking. The creature wasn't dead. The final confrontation. The pool of black liquid churned violently, bubbles rising to the surface as the creature began to reform. Its guttural growl grew louder, reverberating through the chamber like a death knell. Elias and his companions backed away, their relief shattered by the realization that the beast was not yet defeated. "It's not over," Elias muttered, his grip tightening on his knife. "We need to destroy the pool. That's where it's drawing its power." Miriam stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I have something that might help," she said, pulling a small pouch from her satchel. Inside was a fine, silvery powder that glimmered faintly in the torchlight. "This is purified salt, infused with herbs and blessed by the old ways. It should disrupt the dark energy sustaining the creature." Elias nodded. "Do it." As Miriam began to sprinkle the powder around the edge of the pool, the creature's form solidified once more. It emerged from the liquid, its body larger and more grotesque than before. Its eyes burned with fury, and its voice was a deafening roar. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal." Elias stepped forward, his knife raised. "You're not eternal. You're just a parasite, feeding on fear. And we're done being afraid." The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Elias dodged, but the beast was faster and stronger than ever. It struck him with a blow that sent him crashing into the wall. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand, his vision swimming. Sarah and Tom charged at the creature, their weapons raised. Sarah swung a makeshift spear, aiming for the beast's chest, while Tom brought his hammer down on its arm. The creature roared in pain, its form flickering as the blows landed. But it was still too powerful, too fast. It swatted them aside like insects, sending them sprawling to the ground. Miriam continued to work, her hands trembling as she spread the powder around the pool. The creature turned its attention to her, its eyes narrowing. "You think your petty tricks can stop me?" it snarled, stalking toward her. Elias saw the danger and acted without thinking. He grabbed a torch and hurled it at the creature, the flames catching on its oily skin. The beast howled in pain, its form writhing as the fire spread. Elias seized the opportunity and charged, driving his knife into the creature's side. The beast roared, its claws slashing at Elias. He gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to let go. "This ends now," he shouted, twisting the blade. The creature's form began to dissolve, its body melting into the pool. But Elias knew it wasn't enough. The pool itself was the source of its power, and as long as it existed, the creature could return. "Miriam," he shouted, "finish it." The herbalist nodded and emptied the rest of the powder into the pool. The liquid began to boil and churn, the dark energy dissipating as the purified salt disrupted its connection to the creature. The beast let out a final, ear-splitting shriek as its form disintegrated, its essence consumed by the cleansing light. The chamber fell silent. The pool of black liquid was gone, replaced by a shallow basin of clear water. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air grew warm and still. Elias sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. Sarah and Tom helped Miriam to her feet, their faces pale but relieved. "Is it really over this time?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded, his breathing ragged. "It's over. The creature is gone." The group made their way out of the cave, their steps slow and unsteady. The forest seemed brighter now, the shadows less menacing. When they emerged into the sunlight, they were greeted by the sight of the townsfolk gathered at the edge of the clearing. Word had spread quickly, and the people of Hollow Hill had come to see if the beast had truly been defeated. Elias stepped forward, his face grim but resolute. "It's done," he said. "The creature is gone." The crowd erupted into cheers, their fear and tension giving way to relief and joy. But Elias felt no sense of triumph. He had faced the darkness within himself and emerged victorious, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. In the days that followed, life in Hollow Hill began to return to normal. The townsfolk rebuilt what had been destroyed, and the forest slowly healed from the creature's corruption. Elias stayed in the town for a while, helping where he could, but he knew he couldn't stay forever. The wilderness called to him as it always had, and he needed to find peace in his own way. Before he left, he visited Clara's grave for the first time in years. He knelt by the headstone, his heart heavy with grief and guilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I couldn't save you, but I've made sure no one else will suffer like you did." As he stood to leave, he felt a strange sense of closure. The creature was gone, and with it, the darkness that had haunted him for so long. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The legend of the Beast of Hollow Hill faded over time, becoming just another story told around campfires. But for those who had lived through the terror, it was a reminder of the strength they had found in each other, and the courage it took to face their deepest fears. And Elias Crane, the hunter who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, became a legend in his own right. His name was spoken with reverence, a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable evil. But Elias himself was never one for legends. He simply walked away, disappearing into the wilderness, where the shadows were just shadows, and the only beasts were the ones he could hunt.